My name is Tenzin Rao, and on July 8, 2009, my life changed forever. For over 20 years, I had devoted myself to the life of a Buddhist monk, seeking enlightenment through meditation, discipline, and detachment from worldly desires. My days began before sunrise, sitting in silent contemplation for hours, followed by teaching others the principles of mindfulness and inner peace. I believed that suffering was an inescapable part of existence, something that could only be overcome by transcending the self and letting go of all attachments. To me, nirvana, the ultimate liberation, was the only true goal, the path to escaping the endless cycle of rebirth. From the moment I entered the monastery, I fully immersed myself in the teachings of the Buddha. I had learned to quiet my mind, to detach from emotions, and to see life as a fleeting illusion, ever-changing and impermanent. Over the years, I guided countless students, helping them release their fears and desires, showing them how to break free from suffering through meditation and discipline. Christianity was never something I gave much thought to. I saw it as another path people used to seek truth, but it seemed so different from what I had come to understand, rooted in attachment, in longing for salvation, in dependence on a deity rather than self-liberation. For years, my life was peaceful, predictable, and deeply fulfilling. I believed I had found true wisdom, that I understood the nature of existence. But everything changed one evening in ways I never could have imagined. It began like any other day. I had spent the morning leading a meditation session for visitors, guiding them through controlled breathing and stillness, then spent the afternoon studying sacred texts. As the sun began to set, I decided to take my usual evening walk through the monastery gardens. This was a time I cherished, a moment of solitude where I could reflect on the teachings I had spent my life studying and practicing. The rhythmic rustling of the leaves, the distant chants of my fellow monks, and the scent of incense lingering in the air always brought me a deep sense of peace. But on that particular evening, something felt different. I couldn't explain it at the time, but there was a heaviness in the air, an unease that settled in my chest like a whisper of something unseen. At first, it was subtle, just a faint pressure in the center of my chest. I ignored it, assuming it was a minor discomfort, perhaps caused by fatigue from the day's meditations. But as I continued walking, the sensation grew stronger, transforming into a deep, burning pain that radiated through my arms. My breathing became shallow, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I tried to steady myself, focusing on my breath, anchoring my awareness as I had done thousands of times before. But no matter how deeply I inhaled, no matter how much I tried to center my mind, the pain only grew worse. I sank to the ground in a meditative posture, hoping to calm my body through stillness, but it was as if I were losing control of myself entirely. The world around me blurred, the vibrant colors of the garden fading into a dull haze. The distant sound of chanting became muffled, as if I were sinking beneath the surface of deep water. Panic threatened to take hold, but I fought against it, clinging to the principles I had lived by: impermanence, non-attachment, the acceptance of suffering. Then, in an instant, the world around me disappeared. There was no sound. No light. Just an overwhelming, suffocating darkness. For a moment, I thought this was death, that I had finally reached the end of my existence, dissolving into the emptiness I had long contemplated. But something was wrong. I had always believed that death was a transition, a fading into nothingness, a release from the self. Yet, in this darkness, I was still aware. I could still think. I could still feel. And the more I became conscious of this, the more I realized that I was not alone. At first, it was just a presence, something I couldn't see but could feel all around me. A weight, a force, a knowing. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced in meditation, unlike any state of awareness I had ever reached. It wasn't empty or detached, it was full, overwhelming, alive. And then, without warning, I felt myself being pulled, as if something unseen had taken hold of me. It was not violent or forceful, but it was undeniable, as if I were being drawn toward something beyond my understanding. I tried to resist, though I wasn't sure why. But the more I fought, the stronger the pull became, until finally, the darkness cracked, and I saw it. A light. It was unlike any light I had ever seen, not just bright, but living, radiating something deeper than warmth. It wasn't just light, it was love. Pure, unfiltered, limitless love. It surrounded me, enveloped me, pulling me in like the embrace of something that had always been waiting for me. And as I moved closer, I began to realize that this was not some abstract energy or vision. There was someone within the light. A figure stepping forward, emerging from the radiance. And as soon as I saw him, I knew. It was Jesus. The moment I saw him, everything inside me resisted. This couldn't be real. I had spent my entire life devoted to Buddhism, seeking enlightenment through detachment, rejecting the idea of a personal God. And yet, here he was standing before me, more real than anything I had ever known. His presence wasn't just something I saw, it was something I felt deep in my soul. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, I realized he knew everything about me, my thoughts, my doubts, my struggles, even the things I had buried so deep within myself that I had long forgotten them. And yet, there was no judgment in his gaze. Only love. A love so pure and overwhelming that I could barely stand under the weight of it. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was, why he was here, why I was here. But before I could say a word, he did. His voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, not loud, not soft, but filled with an authority that shook me to my core. Yet at the same time, it carried a gentleness that made every fear inside me melt away. "You have sought truth your entire life," he said. "And now you stand before it." His words struck me like a thunderbolt. I had spent decades in meditation, searching for truth, believing that peace could only be found in detachment. But here he was, telling me that truth was not found in emptiness, it was found in him. I wanted to resist, to argue, to tell him that my path had already been set, that I had spent years walking toward enlightenment. But deep inside, something within me stirred, something I could not ignore. Because in that moment, I knew that what I was seeing, what I was feeling was real. I stood there, overwhelmed, struggling to process what was happening. Every belief I had held, every teaching I had followed, seemed to crumble in the presence of this man. I had always thought that enlightenment was about letting go, about emptying oneself of attachment and dissolving into nothingness. But Jesus wasn't asking me to let go, he was inviting me to be filled. He wasn't distant or detached. He was near, personal, and undeniably real. "You have spent your life searching," he said, his voice calm yet filled with authority. "But what you seek is not found in detachment. It is found in love." Love. That word resonated deep within me, in a way it never had before. I had always been taught that suffering was a reality to be accepted and transcended, that life was impermanent, and that to desire was to suffer. But as I stood before Jesus, I felt something entirely different, not the cold acceptance of suffering, but the presence of a love so powerful that it seemed to wrap around me like a warm embrace. It wasn't just a concept. It wasn't just an idea. It was a person. And for the first time in my life, I realized that peace wasn't found in emptiness. It was found in him. Then, suddenly, the scene around me shifted. The brilliant light that had surrounded Jesus began to fade, and in its place, I found myself somewhere else, somewhere far more terrifying. The warmth disappeared, replaced by a deep, suffocating heaviness. The air itself felt thick, oppressive, filled with a sorrow I had never known. And as I looked around, I realized I was in a place I never believed existed. The warmth of the light vanished, and suddenly, I was surrounded by something I had never felt before, a crushing, unbearable emptiness. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very space around me was pressing in on my soul. A deep, overwhelming darkness stretched in every direction, but this was not just the absence of light. It was the absence of hope, of love, of anything good. Then, faintly, I heard something, a distant sound, barely audible at first, like a murmur carried by the wind. But as I focused, the murmur grew into cries, desperate and endless, coming from all around me. I turned, trying to see through the darkness, and what I saw shook me to my core. Figures moved in the shadows, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror. Some were reaching as if grasping for something unseen, something just out of their reach. Others wandered aimlessly, muttering to themselves, their voices filled with despair. But what terrified me most was that no one acknowledged anyone else, as if they were completely alone, trapped in their own suffering, their own regrets. This wasn't fire and demons like the stories I had dismissed before. This was worse. This was eternal isolation, the complete absence of love, of peace, of God Himself. Panic surged through me as I realized where I was because I had never believed in hell. I had spent my life thinking that suffering was just part of the cycle, something temporary that could be escaped through enlightenment. But here, suffering never ended. There was no escape, no release, no peace, only an endless awareness of what had been lost. I wanted to cry out, to run, to find a way out of this terrible place. And then, suddenly, I heard His voice again, not in anger, not in condemnation, but in sorrow. "This is the result of separation from me," Jesus said, His words cutting through the darkness like a blade. "It is not my desire for any to be here. But love requires choice." His words echoed in my mind, love requires choice. I had spent my life believing that all paths led to the same truth, that every religion was just a different expression of the same ultimate reality. But here, standing in the midst of this horrifying emptiness, I realized how wrong I had been. Not all paths led to life. Some led here to separation, to regret, to a void where the presence of God no longer existed. And the people trapped here were not being punished by an external force. They had chosen this. They had chosen to reject Him, to turn away from the very love that had been reaching for them their entire lives. And now, they were left with the consequences of that choice forever. I turned desperately, searching for Jesus, longing for the light again. I couldn't bear this place, couldn't stand the weight of the emptiness that filled every corner of it. Fear gripped me, a fear unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't the fear of pain or suffering, it was the fear of never feeling love again, never being whole again, never knowing peace again. I wanted to cry out, to beg for another chance, but before I could even speak, I felt something pulling at me once more. The darkness around me began to shift, unraveling like a veil being lifted. The cries faded. The weight pressing on my soul began to lift. And then, in an instant, I was back in the light. Jesus stood before me again, His face full of love but also sadness. He had shown me something I never believed in, something I never wanted to believe in. But I couldn't deny it. I had seen it. I had felt it. And now I had to choose. Would I continue to cling to the beliefs I had always known? Or would I accept the truth that had just been revealed to me? Jesus looked at me, and with the same gentle authority as before, He spoke once more. "You have seen," He said. "Now you must decide." I stood there frozen, my mind racing. Everything in me wanted to resist, to retreat back into the teachings I had followed my entire life, to convince myself that what I had seen was just an illusion. But I couldn't. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I had spent years believing that enlightenment came from detachment, that suffering was simply a reality to be accepted and transcended. But now, I realized that peace wasn't found in emptying oneself, it was found in being filled. And what I had been missing, what I had been searching for all these years, was standing right in front of me. It had always been Him. Tears filled my eyes as the weight of the truth settled deep in my soul. I had been wrong. Not just about Christianity, not just about the existence of God, but about the very nature of life itself. I had always thought that seeking the divine meant withdrawing from the world, from emotions, from desire. But Jesus was showing me that true peace wasn't found in detachment, it was found in relationship. Not in escaping suffering, but in love. A love that was unlike anything I had ever known. A love that wasn't earned through effort, wasn't achieved through discipline. A love that was simply given freely, completely. Grace. I fell to my knees, overcome with emotion. "Lord, I don't understand everything," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I know You're real. I know You are the truth. I don't want to be separated from You. I don't want to walk this path alone anymore." And in that moment, as soon as the words left my lips, I felt something I had never felt before. A peace deeper than anything meditation had ever brought me. A love greater than anything I had ever imagined. A presence so overwhelming, so pure, that it filled every empty space inside me. I had spent my life searching for truth. And now, I had finally found it. The moment I surrendered, something inside me changed. It was as if a great weight, one I hadn't even realized I had been carrying, had been lifted from my soul. I had spent years trying to quiet my mind, to empty myself of suffering, to detach from the world in pursuit of peace. But now, for the first time, I wasn't empty, I was full. Full of love, full of light, full of something greater than I had ever known. I had spent my life chasing enlightenment, but what I had really been chasing was him. And he had been there all along, waiting for me to see the truth. Jesus reached out his hand and placed it on my shoulder. The warmth of his touch spread through me like fire, not a burning flame, but a gentle, consuming warmth that reached the deepest parts of me. I felt every wound, every doubt, every question melt away in his presence. And then, with a voice full of love, he spoke again. "It is not yet your time. You must return. You must share what you have seen." My heart sank. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in the light, to remain in this presence forever. But I understood. I had been given a gift, not just for myself, but for others. There were people still searching, people still walking in darkness, people who needed to know the truth. Before I could even respond, I felt it again, that same pull I had felt before, but this time in reverse. The light around me began to fade, and the warmth of Jesus' presence started to slip away. I tried to hold on, but I was being drawn back into the world I had left behind. My heart ached as the brilliance dimmed, as the overwhelming peace gave way to something else. Then, just as suddenly as I had left, I was back. Back in my body. Back in the hospital. Back to a world that suddenly felt so much smaller than it had before. I gasped for air as my eyes shot open, my chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The blinding fluorescent lights above me burned my eyes, and the distant sound of beeping machines filled my ears. For a moment, I was disoriented, caught between two realities, the one I had just left behind and the one I had returned to. Nurses and doctors rushed around me, their voices urgent, their hands adjusting IVs and monitoring my vitals. I could hear them exclaiming in disbelief. "He's back! We lost him, but he's back!" I turned my head slightly, my body weak, and saw the familiar face of my abbot standing in the corner of the room. His hands were still clasped in prayer, his lips moving in silent recitation, but as his eyes met mine, I saw something I had never seen before: fear. He had always been a man of great composure, someone who carried an air of wisdom and control, yet now, he looked at me with uncertainty. I realized that he too had been praying for me to return. But what would I tell him? How could I even begin to explain what I had just experienced? Over the next few days, as my body recovered, my mind wrestled with the enormity of what had happened. I couldn't keep this to myself. I had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to share the truth. But how could I tell my fellow monks, people who had lived their entire lives as I had, devoted to detachment and enlightenment, that everything we had believed was incomplete? That salvation wasn't found in self-discipline or transcendence, but in a person? In Jesus? The thought terrified me. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, I knew I had no choice. Jesus had sent me back for a reason. And I had to obey. When I was finally strong enough to leave the hospital, I returned to the monastery, but everything felt different. The walls that had once given me a sense of peace now felt confining. The chants of my fellow monks, which had always been a source of comfort, now felt distant, like echoes of a life I no longer belonged to. I still respected the discipline, the teachings, the structure, but I knew something they didn't. I had seen what lay beyond death, and I had met the one who held the truth in his hands. For a while, I kept my experience to myself, unsure of how to even begin. Every night, I lay awake, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The light, the love, the presence of Jesus, the horror of hell, it was all so real, so vivid, more real than anything I had ever experienced in my earthly life. And yet, I felt trapped between two worlds. If I spoke, I risked losing everything: my place in the monastery, the respect of my teachers, the only life I had ever known. But if I stayed silent, I would be denying the very reason Jesus had sent me back. One evening, as I sat in the meditation hall with my fellow monks, I finally found the courage to speak. My voice trembled as I began, but once I started, the words poured out of me. I told them everything: how I had died, how I had been pulled into the darkness, how I had seen the reality of hell and its eternal separation from God. I told them about the light, about Jesus, about the love that filled me in a way no meditation ever had. As I spoke, the room fell silent. Some monks looked at me with curiosity, others with concern, and some with outright disbelief. When I finished, a deep stillness settled over us. Then, one of the senior monks stood up, his expression unreadable, and said, "You are speaking of things that do not belong to our path." My heart pounded in my chest. I had spoken the truth, and now, I would have to face the consequences. The days that followed were filled with tension. Whispers followed me wherever I went. Monks who had once sought my guidance now avoided my gaze. Some of them, especially the younger ones, seemed curious, even intrigued by what I had shared, but fear held them back from speaking openly. Others weren't so subtle in their disapproval. They told me I was confused, deceived, lost. They warned me that my visions were nothing more than illusions created by my mind as it clung to life. But I knew the truth. I had not imagined Jesus. I had not imagined hell. I had not imagined the love that had filled me in His presence. Despite the rejection, I also saw something else: doubt. Some of my brothers, even the most disciplined ones, couldn't hide the unease in their eyes. What if I wasn't wrong? What if everything we had believed was missing something essential? Late at night, a few monks came to me in secret, asking questions they had never dared voice before. What did he look like? What did he say to you? Could it be true? These were men who had spent their entire lives devoted to detachment, yet now, for the first time, they were longing for something more. I could see it in them, the quiet stirring of their hearts, the pull toward a truth they had never known. But not everyone was willing to question. One evening, I was called to stand before the monastery elders. Their faces were stern, their expressions heavy with disappointment. "You are disturbing the peace of this place," one of them said. "You are bringing confusion, introducing foreign ideas. If you continue, you will have no place here." My heart pounded. This was my home, the only life I had ever known. But at that moment, I understood something clearly: I couldn't stay. I couldn't deny what I had seen. I couldn't turn my back on the truth Jesus had shown me. I had been sent back to share this message, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, I bowed my head in respect and, with sadness in my heart, made my choice. I would leave the monastery. I would follow Jesus, no matter what it cost me. Leaving the monastery was the hardest thing I had ever done. For over 20 years, it had been my home, my refuge, my entire way of life. I had taken vows of discipline, given up all worldly attachments, and committed myself to a path that I believed led to truth. And yet, the moment I walked through those gates for the last time, I knew I had done the right thing. There was no turning back. I had seen the reality of eternity, and I had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to live for something greater. At first, I didn't know where to go. I had no possessions, no money, and nowhere to turn. I had spent my entire life in the monastery, and stepping into the outside world felt overwhelming. But even in my uncertainty, I wasn't afraid. I had walked away from everything I had ever known, but I wasn't alone. Jesus was with me. I could feel His presence, guiding me, reminding me of the love I had experienced in the light. I knew that if He had brought me this far, He would not abandon me now. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn to places I had never been before: Christian churches, small groups of believers who welcomed me with kindness and open hearts. At first, I felt like an outsider. My shaved head, my monk's robes, my way of speaking, it all set me apart. But as I listened to the words of Jesus in the Gospels for the first time, I realized something incredible. His teachings were not foreign to me. They were familiar. The love, the humility, the selflessness, it was everything I had been searching for my entire life. But there was one thing that made it different: grace. The idea that salvation was not something to be earned through discipline and effort, but something freely given through Jesus' sacrifice. That was what had been missing all along. And now, I had to make a choice once again. Would I keep this truth to myself? Or would I share it, just as Jesus had told me to? The answer was clear. I had to tell the world. At first, I didn't know where to begin. How could I, a former Buddhist monk, explain to people, especially those who had lived as I had, that everything I had once believed was incomplete? How could I tell them that Jesus was real, that hell was real, that heaven was real, and that we were never meant to walk this path alone? I felt unprepared, unworthy, and completely out of place. But every time doubt crept into my heart, I remembered Jesus' words, "You must share what you have seen." He had not shown me these things to keep them hidden. He had sent me back so that I could help others see the truth. So I began to speak. At first, it was just small conversations, one-on-one encounters with people who were curious about my journey. Some listened with open hearts, eager to hear about my experience. Others dismissed me entirely, convinced that I had been deceived or that my near-death experience was just the result of brain activity. I faced skepticism, rejection, and at times, even hostility. But none of it mattered. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. I knew that Jesus was real. And for those who were willing to listen, for those who had been searching like I once had, my testimony became a light in their own journey toward truth. Then, something happened that I never expected. People began seeking me out, wanting to hear more. They asked questions, some filled with desperation, longing to know if there was hope for them. Others, like me, had followed paths of self-discipline and detachment, yet still felt something missing inside. I knew their pain because I had lived it. And so, I kept speaking. I shared my story in churches, in small gatherings, and eventually even online. The more I spoke, the more I saw lives being changed, not because of me, but because of Him. Jesus was reaching people through my testimony, just as He had reached me. And that was when I realized, this was my purpose now. This was why He had sent me back. As more people heard my story, the responses became even more overwhelming. Some reached out to me in tears, confessing that they had been searching for truth their entire lives but had never found peace. Others admitted that they had experienced dreams or visions of Jesus but had been too afraid to acknowledge them. Many had lived just as I had, devoted to spiritual discipline, believing they were on the right path, yet still feeling empty inside. And when they heard what I had seen, what I had experienced, something inside them awakened. They weren't just hearing my story, they were seeing themselves in it. But not everyone responded with acceptance. Some of my former brothers from the monastery contacted me, not with curiosity, but with anger. They accused me of betraying my vows, of abandoning my discipline, of corrupting the teachings I had once upheld. Some begged me to return, telling me that I had been deceived, that I was throwing away a lifetime of wisdom for an illusion. Their words should have shaken me. But they didn't. Because deep in my heart I knew the truth. I had not abandoned wisdom. I had finally found it. The rejection hurt, but I had already counted the cost. I had lost my home, my reputation, and the only life I had ever known. But what I had gained was worth infinitely more. I had encountered Jesus. I had felt His love. I had seen eternity. And I knew that no amount of loss could compare to the gift I had been given. So, I pressed forward, speaking the truth no matter the opposition. Because I knew that somewhere out there, someone else was searching, just like I had been. And maybe, just maybe, my story would be the answer they had been waiting for. As time went on, I began to see the deeper purpose behind everything I had been through. I wasn't just saved for myself, I was saved so that I could reach others who were lost, just as I had been. My life had taken a path I never expected, but I was exactly where I was meant to be. People from all over the world were reaching out, asking questions, searching for the same truth that had been revealed to me. Some were monks, deeply devoted to their own spiritual practices yet sensing that something was missing. Others were skeptics, unsure of what to believe but shaken by my testimony. And then there were those who had never considered faith at all, until they heard my story and realized that eternity was real. I began traveling, speaking in churches, meeting with those who had questions, and sharing my testimony wherever I could. At times it was difficult. There were moments when the weight of my past, the memories of my old life, and the rejection I had faced threatened to pull me back into doubt. But every time those thoughts crept in, I would remember that moment in the light, the moment I saw Jesus, the moment I felt His love, the moment He gave me a second chance. That was what I held on to. That was what gave me strength. This wasn't just my story. This was His story, and I was simply the one He had chosen to tell it. Now, as I look back on my life, I see the hand of God in every step. Every struggle, every doubt, every year I spent searching, it all led me to Him. And now, I have a message for anyone who is listening, for anyone who is searching like I once was. Jesus is real. Heaven is real. Hell is real. And you don't have to wonder anymore. The love you are looking for, the peace your soul is longing for, is found in Him. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to strive for it. It is a gift freely given. All you have to do is accept it. If my story has touched you in any way, I encourage you to take a step toward Jesus today. If you have questions, if you are searching, if you need prayer, leave a comment below. I want to pray for you. And if you want to hear more testimonies of people who have encountered the truth, make sure to subscribe and share this video. Because you never know, someone you love might be searching for the very thing I found. Thank you for listening, and may you find the peace and love that only Jesus can give.